Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you in Berlin. And I must commend IFA for putting together a beautiful conference, particularly to bring about meaningful dialogue on a very important social change that's happening in our times, the transformation of future mobility. Fundamentally, I think mobility has, through human civilization, been the lifeblood of our civilization. And even in this digitized world where we can be connected in so many different ways, I think we're all going to find that human beings will continue to want to move about for social and economic outcomes. So mobility has to be sustained. The automobile in the past century has been such a phenomenal device that it has essentially come to dominate the mobility architecture, a very dominant element of our mobility architecture, no matter whether we talk about the so-called developed world or we talk about the developing world. And it's perhaps something of, it's a situation where we've had too much of a good thing, and nations all over the world are beginning to realize that we've got to find some way to break out of this rather unsustainable habit. Fortunately, not just societies, but even automakers have now come to the realization that something's got to change. And there is going to be concerted effort across societies and industries to figure out how we're going to change future mobility. Rather than talk about the anecdotal experiences of this technology and this solution, we've started to go back to understand why do we want this change. To start with, the world has become extremely urbanized. In a matter of 150 years, between 1900 to 2050, we would have gone from 1 out of every 6 persons on the planet being urban to 4 out of every 6 persons on the planet being urban. And as a result, this has caused a rather acute concentration of all human activity, not just where we live, but where GDP is created, where energy is consumed, where carbon is emitted, into these urban zones. So we have to find smarter ways, particularly in urban areas, of addressing the transformation of the mobility architecture. Now, urban forms are varied. Certainly, you can see 3 different cities here, different distribution of population density, and different spatial extent. So clearly, we have to realize that mobility architectures in urban form have a symbiotic relationship. In fact, in North America, a continent that is predominantly addicted to the automobile, New York City has a rather unusual distribution of mobility, with large dependence on mass transit. And indeed, amongst large cities in the US, New Yorkers have a lower per capita carbon emission because of this dependence on mass transit. But what is important to realize is there are going to be varied solutions, and what is good for Shanghai is not going to be right for Seattle or, for that matter, San Diego. Cities are going to require unique solutions in how they manage mobility. Of course, the other sad thing that we have led ourselves into is the sad situation where a girl such as this, if she were to live in any one of these parts of the world where you've got yellow and purple and pink on the graph, she's probably living in an environment where her lungs are loaded with particulates to the extent of almost smoking 5 to 10 cigarettes a day, just by living her life in any of these cities. Air quality is a major challenge for us to address. Putting all of this together, we have to realize that somewhere between 6 and 10% of global GDP is being sacrificed as a consequence of air quality degradation, traffic accidents and fatalities, and congestion. Perhaps there are some very possible tailwinds. My generation that had grown with a love affair for cars is giving way to a generation that have a love affair with digital devices. And surely the digital transformed society has many opportunities to help us make this change. No doubt, one of the elements or the consequences of this digitized world is this whole concept of a sharing economy, wherein assets are more effectively shared, and therefore we work ourselves to a much more sustainable future. The auto industry's response to all of this is to bring their focus onto 4 foundations, 4 pillars that deal with electrification, connectivity, shared mobility, and autonomy. But in some ways, we have to realize, similar to what George Bernard Shaw had spoken about, we are not going to be able to solve what is really a combination of social need and social aspirations purely with technology. We've got to get back to solving some of the human problems that we're going to face in transforming mobility. Our current mobility architecture, therefore, is inefficient for a number of reasons. Asset inefficiency, less than 5% of a car is used in its lifetime. If I told you that the average mobility required putting a 65-kilogram person in a vehicle that weighs 1,300 kilograms, and you got to move them around, it's an absurd proposition. And finally, the average car occupies about 10 square meters of space. In New York, that's worth $500,000 of real estate. This mobility architecture is not sustainable. When we went back to study what this framework could be, something that all cities around the world could use to start to meaningfully leverage technology and align to what would be a future relevant mobility architecture, we came up with these 4 platforms. It's connectivity, heterogeneity of mobility, intelligent systems, and personalization, something we call chip mobility. Let's start with heterogeneity. Heterogeneity is demolishing this idea that we have a binary choice. It's either a personal car or public transit. Fortunately, as you saw with the previous speaker, the space is now being filled, and it's constantly being added to by innovative new solutions and new mobility shared services. This addresses new modes. Some of them are micro-mobility modes, and some of them are effective ways of sharing assets and sharing space. Cities today have the luxury of really going through a lot of this to figure out how they will pick and choose the constituent elements of their mobility architecture. Once you have all of this mobility architecture, you got to connect them. To me, connection is not just a matter of 5G connectivity, although digital connectivity helps. Connectivity can start with physical infrastructure. A Frankfurt hub is a connectivity solution. Bike stands at metro stations are a connectivity solution. But they can also be digital. The Oyster card allows you to hop from one mode to the other in London. And of course, smartphones are extremely effective in terms of making multimodal journeys. This combination of multiple modes, multiple routes, multiple connections means that we have infinite choices. Fortunately, we have a huge range of intelligent devices and solutions that can help us make the choice. It can help us sort through the journeys in terms of journey time, journey cost, duration, carbon footprint, and so on. And finally, we live in a world where personalization is extremely important. And as an example like IO Mob did from the previous speaker, as Boyd talked about, today we have the ability to configure a journey uniquely for that particular context, taking from all the modes available and all the services that are going to be offered. Now, if this looks vaguely familiar, it's because this is exactly the way we've come to use our telecommunication landscape now. We communicate with a variety of devices. We use a multiplicity of apps, and we customize the combination based on the context of the conversation. And thankfully today, there is a very vibrant and constantly growing ecosystem of not just technology innovators, but business solution and business model innovators that are constantly increasing the number of options we have in configuring the kind of solutions we want. When we look at a company like Daimler, in a way, when you look at their investment portfolio, you realize that in a sense, they're working towards something like the chip architecture because you have heterogeneity in their investments, you've got tools for connectivity, intelligent sorting of data, and personalization. Now, all of this is not going to be enough unless we have stable and forward-looking policies and regulations. Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2017 for his theory of nudge. And what he's basically saying is behavioral economics believes that you can actually nudge behavior of individuals and societies towards things that are favorable for society and nudge them away from things that you don't think are for societal good. This means cities are increasingly focusing on urban planning and mobility design to provide the nudge. They're providing investments in infrastructure to make it easier to do certain things, and policies and regulations that can dynamically keep pace with the kinds of changes that we see. In the previous decades, the auto industry was prominently driven by federal regulations. In the US, it would have been the Department of Transportation, NHTSA, EPA. Increasingly, what we're finding is cities are becoming very important arbiters in terms of how mobility architectures will be shaped. And this means that cities are increasingly becoming active in determining how they will create the kinds of policy framework to shape mobility for their citizens. We're working with a number of cities, including Boston, Singapore, London, and they're all beginning to find a framework such as this as being useful as they, in turn, shape their mobility architectures to be faster, smarter, and greener. Thank you.